This is a secret document. It's dated September the 29th, 2009. It was leaked from the Ministry of Defence in London to WikiLeaks. It identifies what it calls the greatest threats to the national security of the West. At the top of the list are terrorists and Russian spies. Yes, Russian spies. But by far the biggest threat is said to come from one group: journalists, investigative journalists. How gratifying that is. In other words, journalists who do their job, who tell you, the public, how and why politicians lie to you and start wars in your name and threaten your security, must somehow be stopped, coerced, even smeared. This is another secret document, leaked, of course, by WikiLeaks. This one is from the Pentagon in Washington and explains a great deal about the predicament facing Julian Assange. It's dated almost exactly 3 years ago and describes the planning of a smear campaign to destroy WikiLeaks. And I quote, "Destroying WikiLeaks' center of gravity, its public trust. And this would be achieved with," and I quote, "threats of exposure and criminal prosecution," unquote, 3 years ago. Silencing a rare source of independent journalism is the explicit aim. Smear is the method. Why? Because the real threat is not WikiLeaks or Julian Assange, but you, the public. The real threat is you finding out the truth about those who pretend to be democratic and to act in your interests and to promote a peaceful world. The real threat is your right to call your government to account. And by that I don't mean the usual circus of Tweedledee and Tweedledum, with the very honourable exception of Andrew Wilkie. Competing for your vote, but the telling of truths that allow us to examine the cynicism that defines Australia's place in the world, increasingly. When the truth is replaced by silence, said the Soviet dissident Yevtushenko, the silence is a lie. This meeting tonight is about Australia's silence on the denigration of basic liberties such as freedom of speech and the presumption of innocence. It's about the right of Australians to know what their government is doing in their name in secret. It's about the duty of those charged with alerting the public to the truth: journalists, broadcasters, writers, academics, to end their compliance with rapacious power. And it's about the plight of an Australian citizen, and a very courageous one, Julian Assange, threatened with an epic miscarriage of justice and incarceration in a hellhole in America, like the heroic Bradley Manning, whose conditions of torture President Obama called the other day appropriate. In 1917, Edward Bernays, the American nephew of Sigmund Freud, invented the term public relations as a euphemism for propaganda, which he said the Germans had given a bad name. Bernays was the father of spin. He described spin as the intelligent manipulation of the public with, quote, false realities, which a compliant media would dispense. He called this an invisible government that is the true ruling power in democracies. Declassified official files from the past tell us how this invisible government has worked. In 1968, the British Chiefs of Staff wrote, and I quote, "The Soviet Union will not deliberately start general war or even limited war in Europe," unquote. In the 1960s, Prime Minister Robert Menzies lied to us that the Saigon regime had pleaded with Australia to go to war in Vietnam. In fact, we know now that this was false, that Menzies sent our young men to that war on a lie, hoping to impress Washington. He didn't give a damn about the people of Vietnam. Imagine, just imagine, if we'd had WikiLeaks then. All those diggers who died might have lived. That suffering might not have happened. Today, something has changed. Reality is no longer what governments and their echoes in the media say it is. Of all the spectacular revolts across the world, the most exciting and hopeful is the insurrection of knowledge, much of it sparked by WikiLeaks. I know this to be true because over the years, as a reporter and a witness, I have watched the effect of subjugated knowledge give power to people almost instantaneously, from Southeast Asia to the Chagos Islands to the people of East Timor. In those cases, governments said one thing in private and lied in public. Their reaction in being caught out, as I know from personal experience, and Andrew Wilkie certainly knows from personal experience, is ruthless and rough. They hate it. They hate the democracy of knowledge. And they abuse and they smear, and worse, as Julian Assange now knows all too well. In Australia, we have an urgent and critical part to play. For unless we make our voices heard now, Julian Assange is likely to end up in a Kafkaesque judicial system in the US, which is now so corrupted that not a single detainee since 9/11 has been accorded any redress in America's courts, including innocent people detained for years and tortured. Sitting with us today, at my invitation, is one of those people. Like Julian Assange, he's a courageous Australian citizen who was denied the help of his government. His name is David Hicks. For 6 years, David was incarcerated in the hellhole of Guantanamo. He was beaten for hours on end, his bones were broken, and things were done to him that you can't imagine. David was tried in a military kangaroo court, yet has not received legal redress nor a cent in compensation from the US regime or from his own government in Canberra that allowed this outrage to go on and on. I was going to then ask you to join me in showing your support for justice for David, but you've already done that. And thank you. David Hicks. David Hicks broke no Australian law. Even John Howard admitted this. His conviction was illegal. In 2003, the then Shadow Attorney General Robert McClelland demanded a public inquiry into the treatment of David Hicks. 8 years later, McClelland is the Attorney General, and his silence is a scandal. What David Hicks and Julian Assange have in common is that two prime ministers and 2 attorney generals have thrown these Australians into a chasm of injustice and suffering. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have broken no law and are charged with no crime. And yet it's clear the Gillard government is trying to do to Assange what Howard did to David Hicks. Not only has the Prime Minister defamed Assange in suggesting he was guilty of and charged with a crime, not only has the Attorney General threatened to take away the passport of an Australian citizen guilty of no crime, we now learn that they have secretly discussed a charge of treason against Assange. I know that the Attorney General has been personally made fully aware that the circumstances of Assange's problems in Sweden stink. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark, said Marcellus in Hamlet. I would substitute Sweden for Denmark. The other day, the Sydney Morning Herald declared that Assange should give up his appeal and be extradited from Britain. The paper calls Sweden a neutral country. Sweden has not been a neutral country for 30 years. 2 weeks ago, a parliamentary briefing in Canberra heard expert evidence that under international standards, the behaviour of leading figures in the Assange case in Sweden would be considered, and I quote, highly improper and reprehensible and preclude a fair trial. The Swedish Prime Minister is a warmongering mate of George W. Bush and has hired Bush's crony, Karl Rove, to advise him on the problem of Julian Assange. The law partner of one of the leading figures pursuing Assange was the Minister of Justice, who in 2001 secretly handed over 2 innocent asylum seekers to a CIA kidnap squad at Stockholm Airport. Sweden later awarded them damages for their torture in Egypt. The implications for Julian Assange in Sweden are dire. Not a word of this critical hearing in Canberra was reported or broadcast in the mainstream media in Australia. Instead, we've been saturated with the spectacle of Julia Gillard in Washington. Yet again, an Australian Prime Minister has made us a laughingstock. In her so-called historic dress to Congress, a Congress half filled with interns and minor officials, Gillard surpassed Robert Menzies' notorious declaration of love for the Queen. It actually reminded me of a grovelling Stalinist party boss in Eastern Europe summoned to Moscow during the Cold War, that her foreign minister was at the same time ranging the Middle East, trying to start an air war over Libya, added a macabre element to the whole farce. The Australian media reported that Gillard's speech was punctuated with ovations, with members rising to their feet. Have they no clue that all of this is orchestrated? Watch the footage of Blair during the same turn, and Bush and Obama. The standing ovations are mandatory. It's what Edward Bernays would call false reality. However, there was serious purpose: to ensure that Australian troops remain in Afghanistan, that disaster where NATO's latest achievement is the killing of 9 children collecting firewood. Have we no pride? Have we no historical sense that with every Prime Minister we elect, the first priority is the wishes of the United States, a nation whose record of violence is documented in the crushing of 50 governments since World War II, many of them democracies? It's no wonder that WikiLeaks and real journalism are considered threats, as in that document. In Washington, Gillard described Hillary Clinton as, and I quote, the emblem of female leadership. As WikiLeaks has revealed, this emblem of female leadership ran a secret spy campaign against members of the United Nations, demanding their credit card numbers, passwords, even DNA, all of it illegal. And it was Clinton who in 2008 said she was prepared to, and I quote, annihilate Iran. We have a right to know about these machinations. We have a right to know that Kevin Rudd advised America to attack China if the Chinese didn't do what they were told. We have a right to know that Kim Beazley wanted to commit the Labour Party to an American war with China over Taiwan. That key ALP plotters like Mark Habib are assets of the US Embassy in Canberra. That Obama is no different from Bush, that secret US provocations inside Pakistan now threaten a nuclear war. We have a right to know these things, just as the people of Egypt and Tunisia had the right to know about the corruption of their regimes, and they acted on that information. At the close of this meeting, I'll offer a few thoughts on what I think we might do. Certainly we can be inspired by what others have already done fearlessly, and we too can then lose our fear. Thank you.